Hi, this is Nando from CNC Commentaries. On this episode of CNC Movie Breakdowns, we're going to be talking about a movie that I enjoy very much, Catch Me If You Can. And I am, of course, joined by my gracious co-host, Chase.
Hey, that's me.
Yeah,
Yeah, I enjoy this film very much. I feel like I'm having a sense of deja vu. I feel like I've talked about it before on this channel.
yeah, definitely. Anyway,
But yeah,
Catch Me If You Can. It was,
quite the film
it was based on a true story.
that it was.
And, it's pretty good. Directed by Spielberg, music John Williams. There.
I mean, most Steven Spielberg films have music done by John Williams. So
Yeah, and he's great. You can't go wrong when you've got Spielberg and John on the job.
I mean, you can, but it may be controversial for me to say, but this might be my favorite Spielberg.
Well, this definitely is my favorite Spielberg movie.
Of course, I'm not saying this is Spielberg at his, like technical best or anything, but because Schindler's List, of course, and Jaws, Jurassic Park. But this film is just so rewatchable, for me for some reason.
Yeah.
I love it.
This film's also got some very talented actors in it.
It does.
You got Christopher Walken, you got Tom Hanks, you got Leonardo DiCaprio, and a real talented set of characters here. And I think they enhanced the movie so much. If this movie was had like lesser talented actors, I don't think it would work nearly as well. But anyway, before we dive in, why don't we go into our initial thoughts on this movie?
Okay.
I'll go first. And for my initial thoughts, I watched this movie for the first time with you, so that made it more interesting. And I think it was certainly interesting to watch it with another person, because I remember constantly going and asking when we were watching the movie, like, wow, did that really happen? Because this movie is based on a true story, and it was definitely interesting to think somebody, Frank Abagnale, somebody could have done this. This really happened.
Well, I mean, the story does, of course, change things here and there for dramatic effect.
No, that majority of it pretty spot on. And I think that's really something.
Yeah.
So going into the movie for the first time, it was very interesting. I saw all the big names. You got Leonardo DiCaprio, Tom Hanks, Christopher Walken, Steven Spielberg, John Williams. So I had pretty high expectations, and yeah, this movie definitely knocked it out of the park. Now, what about your initial thoughts, Chase?
I mean, yeah, I'm right there with you. I remember watching this for the first time many years ago, and just I didn't really know a lot about it. I remember seeing the match game clip before seeing the film, and yeah, I was just enthralled the whole time, the whole cat and mouse chase of it all, and yeah, I love it, and I've rewatched it. It's a great film.
Yeah, certainly. And it definitely keeps you occupied the whole time, because this is a pretty long movie, and it doesn't drag on for me. I think it's paced pretty well. So that was interesting to watch for me, because usually with movies this long I get kind of bored, if the subject material or the movie isn't made that well. But this movie definitely enthralled me. But with our initial thoughts out of the way, why don't you give us a general synopsis here?
Yeah, I probably should have done that before, but Catch Me If You Can was released in 2002. It was directed by Steven Spielberg, as mentioned previously. Stars Leonardo DiCaprio as Frank Abagnale Jr., who he's a young boy. He's about 17 or so, and after he finds out his parents are getting divorced, he goes on the run, and he throughout the course of the film pretends to be a pilot, a lawyer, a doctor, all while this FBI agent Carl Hanratty is chasing after him.
Yeah.
And yeah,
And yeah, I think it's certainly interesting because after this movie ends, it's certainly interesting to watch Frank Abagnale's entire story because the story continues until after the movie ends, and he's still alive to this day, which I certainly thought was interesting. The movie is just a giant chase scene. But with that, let's get into our first scene here. Let's dive on it.
He's like Carl Hanratty, and then it cuts to Tom Hanks in France catching Frank.
Yeah, you can see Frank when he's in France and he's in that French prison. He's not exactly having the best time.
I mean, unless Frank is just a great actor,
Yeah.
but it looked like he was pretty miserable.
Yeah, so he's in like this terrible French prison, and like he obviously conditions are terrible. He's like dying.
Yeah,
and
sounds like he's got like whooping cough or something.
Yeah, and I watched a talk that Frank, like the real Frank Abagnale, did, and he said that I think he entered the prison at 160, and he at 160 pounds, and he left the prison at like 110 or 120. So obviously he was not having a good time in this prison.
He was just working out a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, he's got to lose those pounds. He's got. But yeah, Carl's like reading him this extradition treaty and everything, and eventually Frank just collapses, and they try to take him to a doctor, but Frank tries to run, and he's like half dead, so he can't really run.
I mean, might as well try.
Yeah. Even at like half death, he's still trying to get away. And yeah, eventually they put him on a plane, and we go back a couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
And we get this little ceremony scene. We see Frank and Frank Jr. and Frank Sr. Frank Sr. is played by Christopher Walken.
Yes, the great Christopher Walken, as always.
And we get this really, really good line by Christopher Walken.
One of the best lines, I'd say, in maybe all of cinema.
This is one of my favorite Christopher Walken lines. And yeah, so basically Christopher Walken is getting like this award, and he tells a speech, and he's like, two mice
fell in a bucket of cream.
First mouse gave up and drowned.
I mean, and it's that quote that kind of sets Frank Jr. on his path, honestly. But that just the way Christopher Walken says it, and exaggerates with his hands. It's typical Christopher Walken in Christopher Walken fashion, and it's beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that's become a joke between us with the two mice.
We see that Frank, he has a nice happy life, and
for now.
Yeah, for now. You see that he has a nice happy life, and that his parents are doing well. We get kind of this backstory with his parents, where we see that Frank Sr. was like a World War II veteran, and he fell in love with his mother in France after they liberated it. And
he said, "I would not leave unless it was with her."
Yeah, I would not leave France unless it was with her. And it's a nice, pretty heartwarming moment, even though we don't really know these characters that well. But you still kind of feel it, and it makes their eventual divorce even worse. Yeah,
because you see them, just setting up the Christmas tree, and then Christopher Walken and I forget the name of the woman that plays the mother, Paula, but then they just start dancing and goofing around, and it just seems like a very sentimental moment. And Frank's kind of just sees them in the living room dancing, and he just like backs up a little bit. And, you think all is well.
Yeah, but then eventually things start to take a turn for the worse. We see that Christopher Walken's in a little trouble with the IRS.
Yeah.
He's being investigated for tax fraud, and that's not great. and we see him try to get a loan at a bank. But you know, it's hard because you know, the bank is a little skeptical because of his deal, because of you know, his problems with the IRS and the fact that the bank doesn't really know him. So he doesn't get the loan, and they eventually start losing things.
Well, yeah, he just wants to get some money for Frank for his birthday, and he's like, they have to sell the car, and
Sell the
he's got
house.
this great line. He's like, well, they bought it for 500 too much,
Yeah,
and they try and go get Frank a suit, and there's that great scene.
yeah. We kind of see like one of Frank's tricks that he learned picked up from his father. We see that Frank kind of, you know, he definitely picks up a lot from his father, and his father like is
Yeah,
like negotiating with this woman at the suit store, and you know the woman doesn't want to let him in, but then he like picks up like a necklace, and then he says, "Oh, miss, it must have slipped right off your neck."
yeah.
Whammo! She opens the door.
Which, it's never really said in the movie, and I never really get a good look at it. But is it the same like chain he uses every time, or does he give it to whatever woman he's doing it to each time, and then buy a new one?
Now, I don't really know.
Because they look very similar. But
Yeah.
I was just like, how do you give it to them, and then you would like a pickpocket take it off them? Which wouldn't surprise me if Frank Jr. or Frank Sr. had pickpocketing abilities.
Yeah. But anyway. So eventually, you know, these things happen, and Frank has to go to a new school,
Hmm.
and the first thing that Frank does is that you know he's well dressed for school, even though it's like a public school, and you know the first thing he does when he gets to his French class is he pretends to be the substitute teacher.
Well, he probably didn't go in, wanting to do that, but then he's in the hallway, and these like bullies or bump into him, and his books fall on the ground, and then he sees them again in that class, and then he's like, he walks in, and they're like, oh, it looks like he'd be dressed like a substitute teacher, and so then he gets this idea, and he pretends to be the sub of the class.
Yep. And you know, eventually he is after about a week. He gets caught and his parents are called in. We learn that he was trying to do all these things, like he was trying to set up a field trip to a bread factory in France.
Yeah.
And that
Which, you know what? If he's teaching the kids, might as well let him.
yeah, and that like he was assigning homework and things like that. But yeah, he notices. But then when he gets home, he finds something out. He finds out that his parents are getting a divorce.
Hmm.
And so you know, in the end, he just he you know you got all these lawyers around him, and one of the people comes up to him and he's like, "Listen, you gotta take this paper into the kitchen and just sign a name, and that's who you're gonna be with, either your mother
Yeah,
or father."
it's very much like rushing. They're rushing Frank to just
Yeah,
do this, do that,
it's
and
very
you can
cold.
kind of see, you can kind of see on his face how he's just like overwhelmed in the scenario,
Yeah,
and
and
then
so
that's why he
he
eventually
runs.
just runs.
Yeah, so he just runs. Yeah, he can't handle it, so he just runs, and eventually he gets on a train, and he runs, and so eventually we kind of get this montage of Frank living on his own, and we see that he tries to cash a bunch of checks at a bunch of different banks, but the banks don't know him, so they don't cash him.
Hmm.
And then we see him edit his driver's license. And this is like one of the first of many, you know, this is him kind of figuring out how to edit documents. And yeah, he makes himself about 10 years older. And it's just interesting. And then
Which he's supposed to be like 17, 18,
no,
right?
he's supposed to be he's 16 years old right now.
Yeah, I know. He does not look 16.
Yeah, he I don't know. I guess people just assume that he's older.
You know, well, yeah, it's all about how you present yourself, right?
Yeah. Then we see that he sees an airline pilot. He sees an airline pilot get off of a car in the street, and he sees all these flight attendants with him, and he sees them. He's kind of mesmerized. So then he pretends to be a schoolboy writing an article about the school newspaper.
Yeah.
And he's talking to like this retired pilot, I guess. And
He just gives him his old badge.
yeah, and you know he just gives it to him, and then you know that's when Frank calls up Pan Am Airways, and then he's like, "Hey, I lost my uniform." And then they're like, "Oh, okay, go to this area and you'll get a new one." And then he goes and gets a co-pilot's uniform.
Yep, simple as that, really. If you want to go in yourself, I like the little interaction between Frank and the you know, Taylor, I guess you'd say. It's like, hey, why are you so nervous? And then you'd be like, you know, how would you feel if you lost your outfit on the first day? And it's like, don't worry, you know, Pan Am's got a lot.
Yeah, and then you know they kind of have this like funny little interaction where Frank tries to write the guy a check, and then the guy's like, "Oh no, just put your employee number, and then they'll take it out of your next paycheck." And Frank's like, "Even better." And we get the first time that Frank writes a letter to his father. And you know there are these like very nice letters. They're just he basically is telling him how he's doing. And it's interesting, that's for sure. You can tell he definitely cares about his father.
Yeah, and you can tell his father is proud of him, especially later in that dinner scene. But it was also kind of skeptical of what's actually going on, because I think, you know, he doesn't want Frank Jr. to fall into the same you know, economic pitfalls that he did.
Yeah. And so yeah, we kind of get like now that he has the uniform, he gets on a plane.
Yeah, he's golden once you have the uniform.
That's another thing about this movie is that Frank is just so confident with his bullshit that he gives people, is that people just believe him.
Yeah, I mean, he wouldn't be able to do this if he didn't have the confidence that he had.
No, and that's another thing. You know, that works. If you're confident enough in the way you present yourself, people will believe you.
Yeah, I mean, especially with when you look like Leonardo DiCaprio, and well, I imagine, you know, Frank Abagnale had to be a little charming in his looks too. Also,
he had to be quite the looker if he was charming this many people.
Yeah, but we see Frank. You know, he's at the airport, and then he goes up and one of the ladies, you know, he's like, "Are you my deadhead from Miami?" And he's like, what's that again?" And she's like, "Oh, you're so funny," or she says something along the lines.
Yeah.
When, you know, it makes us think that like he doesn't really know the lingo or what he's talking about. But later, when he's actually in the plane, you know, the pilots are asking him all these things. He's like, "Oh yeah, I'm just skipping puddles for the next few months, trying to make my keep."
Yeah.
And it's like, when did you have time to read up on like pilot lingo and slang?
Who's writing about pilot lingo? That's my question. But yeah, so you know, then we get that scene where he sleeps with the flight attendant.
Yeah.
And you know, it just kind of makes me think like, oh, that flight attendant, that's jailbait.
Yeah, that's technically a crime.
Yeah. But yeah. And why don't you watch see what happens next?
Well, after you know, so after the flight, you know, we kind of just we see, you know, Frank's been you know, making his way around from, you know, he's been doing this you know, going around from flight to flight, being a quote unquote pilot for a good amount of time now. And this where he goes to meet with his dad?
Yeah, that's the dinner scene.
Yeah, the confrontation, if you will.
Yeah.
So he's like, he goes to meet with his dad for to eat, and this is a nice restaurant. This isn't anything that Frank Senior is used to, and he's like, oh wow, Frank, there's a great moment where Frank Senior picks up a fork, and he's like, why is it so cold? And he's like, that's a chilled salad fork. He's like, what the heck's a chilled salad fork? And so it's this great just not bonding, but heartfelt moments between father and son. And Frank Jr. is like, Dad, I bought you a car.
You bought him a nice Cadillac.
Yeah, nice Cadillac, which, for late 60s, it's a good amount of money.
Yeah. And, his father ends up, like, rejecting the present because, he's like, do you know what happened if the IRS found out I was driving a Cadillac? So, it just comes back. He's having more problems with the IRS. And,
well, I mean, it's hard to get that monkey off your back.
Yeah. And, his father starts getting emotional at the table because, Frank is like, did you talk to Mom yet? And he tells him the story of like, oh, when I went to France, I didn't speak a word of French, and then 6 weeks later, she was my wife.
Yeah.
And, Christopher Walken's line delivery is so good. Like, you feel emotion.
People don't give Christopher Walken enough credit with everything he's done in his career.
Christopher Walken doesn't just do funny lines. He's a good emotional actor.
Hey.
But yeah, eventually that scene ends, and it's just... That's probably one of my favorite scenes in the movie. Like, I like it a lot.
Yeah, I mean, and there's this spans several years, so we get a lot of these moments between them. We get these moments between Frank and his dad, and we get these moments between Frank and Carl. And I feel like, with Frank and Carl, it's also it also feels like a kind of father-son dynamic in a way.
Yeah.
Which we'll get into. They call every year on Christmas.
Mm-hmm.
Which that's another thing we never think about. This is technically an unconventional Christmas movie, if you really want to get into it.
Technically.
But yeah, so right after this,
right after
dinner scene, just a hard cut to Carl.
Yeah, and so Carl has two of his partners, and one of his partners is telling a story of like this. He was undercover. And things like that, and then Carl's just kind of serious, and then eventually he's like, "Oh, want to hear a joke?" And he tells him to go fuck himself. But yeah. So we kind of see that Carl doesn't really like the people that he's working with, and things like that. And this.
Well, yeah, especially earlier they were like kind of, not. Well, they were joking about, he was telling them about, if you change the number on a check, it would take, normally it would go here, but it would take several weeks for it to bounce from there to here. And they're kind of like laughing at him, and they're like, saying things, and just like kind of not as seriously as it should.
Yeah, and this was where Frank is starting to steal money now. He's starting to create fraudulent checks.
Mm-hmm.
And
Big time.
We see that, we saw that when, he was kind of flirting with the bank lady. And the bank lady took him to the back and showed him how the checks were read. And so now he's kind of now that he's a co-pilot, Pan Am and the hotels that he stays at have an agreement that they can cash checks.
Yeah.
And so
he even goes so far as to buy a special type of typewriter to make the checks.
Yeah, and so that way they look like extra real. So basically, his whole process is he'll change the number on a check on the East Coast to one on the West Coast. That way they have to route the check to the West Coast. Then they'll see it's bounced, and that'll take like 2 weeks. So he'll just chill out in one spot for 2 weeks. Then he'll move, and he'll do the process all over again.
Yeah.
And eventually Carl catches up with him at kind of like this it kind of looks like a tiki motel.
Yeah, just a nice tropical like hotel.
Then we
This
get
is
one of
this
my
this might be my favorite scene of the movie.
This probably is my favorite scene. And we kind of see Carl. Carl tells his partners to wait, and he goes in because he finds out that Frank is still at the hotel. And so you could tell that Carl is very nervous. He takes out his gun on the stairs, and he kind of flashes his FBI little badge to the cleaning lady. And eventually he makes it in, and Frank is in the bathroom. And as soon as Frank comes out of the bathroom, Frank just jumps in, and he's like, "Hey, I'm the Secret Service."
Yeah, basically. I mean, and the reason he's able to get away with this is because they have no idea what Frank looks like.
They have no idea what and Frank pulls off this so confidently. He doesn't even stutter. He's just perfectly. He's just pulling it off.
I mean, and who's to say like if this actually happened or if this was, made for the film? But the way that it's done, of just like the back and forth, Frank is deadpan and Carl is basically panic on his face. He's like, no, get down or whatever. And he's like, Frank's just like, can you get the gun out of my face, please? We got him already. You're late.
Yeah.
It's just like the swagger and confidence you need to pull something like that off, going so far as to even like hand over his wallet and be like, oh yeah, my ID badge is in there.
Yeah.
And Carl doesn't open it until, later.
Yeah, and so basically, he tells Carl that this old blind guy is the guy he was looking for.
Yeah, he says he jumped from the window, which you would think a man of that age would not be able to walk after that.
Yeah, you just never know. And then he basically tells Carl like, "Hey, I'm gonna get this evidence down. You chill out here."
Yeah.
So
and then Carl
typewriter. He grabs and walks out.
Carl opens up the wallet and he sees a bunch of like condiment labels and brand labels all inside. And so it pans around in the hotel room, and we just see like labels torn off of stuff. And it's interesting, like a little note, like early in the movie at that awards ceremony in the beginning, we see young Frank, peeling off the label of the wine bottle.
Yeah.
And I think that's a little good touch.
Yeah. And so Carl eventually realizes that he's been bamboozled.
He's been duped.
He's been duped. He's been had. He's been bamboozled. And he eventually runs out, but Frank's already out of there. And we get this scene of Carl talking to his boss at the FBI. And, it's just his boss is like, yeah, don't humiliate yourself. And Carl is like, okay, well, now he's got nothing to hide behind. I know what he looks like.
Yeah. Well, I mean, now that he knows his face, theoretically, it should be easier, right?
Yeah. And a little detail that I found cool was that when Frank gave his name to Carl, he told him that he was Barry Allen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's the Flash's name. So,
which he'll find out later, but
yeah.
And then later, we see Frank at the movie theater watching Goldfinger, and then he goes to get the James Bond style suit, and then while he's at that tailor, he's like, "Okay, there you go, Mr. Fleming."
Yeah.
Playing on Ian Fleming, who wrote the James Bond novels, and so that's all of Frank's various pseudonyms.
Yeah, and then we see that Frank gets the famous exotic like sports cars that James.
The Aston Martin.
Yeah. So he definitely is showing his age. He's like in a James Bond.
Yeah, it's just he's finally feeling the role of the full suaveness.
Yeah.
He's at a hotel and he recognizes, or he thinks he recognizes like a famous actress of some kind.
Yeah, it turned out
And
she was a model.
yeah, they have quite the spicy interaction.
Yeah, and it's really funny because he scams her out of money. It's really...
Well, I mean, she scams him basically.
Well, basically what happens is that she's like, oh, I haven't made money in a while. How much are you willing to pay for me, basically? And Frank's like, oh, okay, and he starts naming prices, and then he eventually gets I believe it's $1,400.
Yeah, something like that.
So what ends up happening is he gives her one of his fraudulent checks for I think it's for $1,600, and so she ends up paying him $200 in cash, and she got the fraudulent check.
Oh yeah, yeah. So I guess technically she was the one that got scammed. But I love during this scene while it's going on, and there's like sensual music as this is going on, but then there's also intercut with Carl at the the wash, and he's pulling out all this laundry from the washing machine, and he's just like, just keeps going and going. He's like, "Is this belong to anybody?"
Yeah.
And then a woman comes and grabs it, and he's like looking for clues, and it's just nice juxtaposition.
Then we get the first phone call between Carl and Frank here.
Merry Christmas.
Yeah, it's on Christmas Eve. And so Frank calls him up and he's like, "Hey, I'm sorry." And he's like, "I want this to end. How do I fix this?" And then Carl basically tells him like, "No, there's no fixing this." And he basically tells him like, "Oh, I'm sorry." And then he says, "Okay, let's talk this out. Where are you?" And then Frank gives him his current like hotel, like where he is.
Mm-hmm.
And then Carl doesn't believe him. He's like, "Oh, you want me to make a fool out of myself and send a bunch of agents over there on Christmas Eve?"
Frank's trying to be friendly, but he's also going about it in a very cocky way.
I don't know about that one. I think that
I mean, a little bit.
I think that he wants this to end. And he's just a kid.
Well, yeah, like especially as it gets later on, he wants it to end, but he just wants to make sure that everything's okay with his mom and dad.
Yeah. And so we get that classic line that Frank's father told Frank, and then Frank's like, do you know the reason that the Yankees always win, Carl? And it's because Carl says the reason that Frank gave to his father, which was the Yankees have, I believe it was Mickey Mantle. Mm-hmm. And the real reason that his father told him that the Yankees always win is because everybody's looking at the uniform. And it's just a very interesting interaction. Frank is picking up another line from his father, and eventually the conversation ends when Carl asks him, "Oh, why are you calling me?" "It's because you've got nobody else to call on Christmas Eve."
Yeah, and that's where it kind of like.
And Frank doesn't like that, and he hangs up the phone. That one got him.
But the same is true for Carl.
Yeah. Carl's working at his office on the FBI on Christmas Eve. And so
eventually we find out Carl has a daughter.
Carl has a 4-year-old daughter named Grace.
I mean, at the time. And then later at the end of the film, he's like, gonna go see my daughter, and then he's like, she's like, I forget what age, but it shows just how they don't even realize how much time has passed and how often they've been talking, like every year.
Yeah. But then we get this scene with Carl at the diner, and he's looking through all these names, and the kid, like his waiter, is like his waiter is like a teenager, and he's like, "Oh, Barry Allen, are you collecting? I've got all of them." And then he's like, "What do you mean, kid?" And he's like, "Barry Allen, the Flash."
Yeah.
And he's like, "The comic book?"
This is the '60s, back when only nerds would this kind of thing.
Yeah. And so yeah, Carl realizes he gets on the phone with his boss, and he tells him that yeah, this guy's a kid. Like he reads comic books, and then he basically tells him like, oh, you gotta check for all these runaways.
Yeah. And eventually he shows up at Frank's mom's house, and there's this back and forth, and they're like, oh well, we think your son Frank might have gotten into a bit of trouble, and the mom, she's not fully aware of like the circumstances that occurred, and she's like, well, how much money does he owe? I got a few hundred saved up or whatever.
Yeah,
and then he's like, millions of dollars.
Yeah. And we understand that his wife has been that his mom has been remarried to one of his father, or one of Frank's father's friends, and that fact's kind of sad.
Yeah.
And it's just that we get that really funny interaction where his mom's like, oh, the boys gotta eat, and I'll pay it off. How much? And then they're like, yeah, the current is like $1.8 million. The current.
And then we cut to this bouncing party that Frank is hosting.
Yeah.
And he's got the slick back hair, the orange shirt, and he's kind of like he's the life of the party right now with all these people he probably doesn't even know. He's getting drinks and there's ladies dancing, and just an average day for Frank.
Yeah.
And then he goes into like a hospital, and we get introduced to a very, very young Amy Adams, one of her first roles, I believe, as Nurse Brenda.
Yeah.
And this kind of sets Frank on a new path, and he just spur of the moment, he's like, I want to be a doctor.
Yeah.
You apparently you don't need a medical license. You don't need to go to school for that.
Yeah,
just
technically, if you can just bullshit your way through people, you're just a doctor now. You're just a...
Well, no, I remember reading that the real Frank Abagnale, he never like did any operations or anything like that. Kind of like in the scene that we see, he just was there,
yeah,
kind of
he was just
telling people what to do. Yeah. He's like,
he...
do you concur?
Yeah. Yeah, he kind of like there's this really funny scene where him and two other doctors, like two of his subordinates, who are like learning how to be doctors. He gets like all his doctor lines from movies. He gets all his...
And he does the same thing when he's trying to become a lawyer. He just stays up all night, watching these shows, and probably very few books.
Yeah.
His ability to retain things is pretty.
Yeah, I would be thinking that he's got to be like taking some notes or something. I don't know.
One would imagine, but he's doing this so on the fly, and you wonder where he finds the time.
Yeah, he's just suave.
We get another semi-sensual scene between him and Nurse Brenda. She starts, licking her lips, talking about her they have a conversation about braces. And, Frank's like, oh yeah, I had braces. I hated them. But, they made my teeth better. And, for that, I'm glad.
Yeah. And it's just, he eventually gets the position. And we get that scene where he's talking to Brenda, and Brenda has excuse me. Brenda has finally gotten her braces off. And him and Brenda kind of well, you know what, you take this part, dude.
Well, they they engage in coitus.
Yes.
Um, and there's this very it gets very sad. This moment between you feel like this is the first person besides his parents Frank's really cared for, and I feel like he really does care for her. Um, and they have this touch moment. They're in each other's arms, and Brenda's kind of hesitant about falling in love again or potentially having her heart broken, because she previously got pregnant
Yeah,
and
she
had to
had
have an
a
abortion, and
yeah, so she's
so
just
her
really
parents
scared.
kind of her parents basically disowned her because of that. She comes from a very highly religious household, um, and so she's kind of like nervous about going back and falling in love again, having the same thing happen, or her parents are rightly very, or not rightly, but her parents are cautious about who she brings back. But she does bring him back to meet her parents.
Yeah, because Frank is like, oh, what if I talk to them?
Yeah, and her dad is played by Martin Sheen.
Yeah.
But there's this dinner scene that's very interesting.
Yeah, for sure. But I think another important scene that we kind of skipped off of is where Carl eventually visits Frank's father, Christopher
Oh yeah,
Walken,
yeah,
and he gets there before Frank gets home, and it's just kind of it's just a little bit strange because the first thing that Christopher Walken says to Carl is that, like, if you're here to arrest me, let me put on a different suit,
yeah.
because he thinks that the IRS is finally catching up with him. And now Carl says, like, oh, I'm looking for your son. And
Yeah. And
basically,
then Frank Senior basically says that Frank has joined the military and gone off.
so basically, Frank is, Christopher Walken's lying to protect his son. And it's just kind of like heartwarming that his father would sell him out.
Yeah. And it's kind of like he kind of like insinuates the like, even if I did know where he was or where
I
he was
wouldn't
going,
tell
I
you.
wouldn't I wouldn't tell you.
Yeah.
So practically a dead end for Carl.
Yeah, and we kind of get the his lie seems to work until Frank, or not Frank, sorry, Carl, like, sifts through his letters trying to find something to write on, and then he sees that his son wrote him a letter.
Yeah.
And then he outright tells him, he tells Carl, like, yeah, I'm not giving up my son. And it's just kind of a I really like the dynamic between the father son dynamic here, because we don't the mother son dynamic isn't really explored here, but there's definitely a relationship between his Frank and his father.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And there's also that relationship between Frank and Carl.
Yeah. And I think eventually,
But
like,
let's.
oh, sorry, continue.
Oh, I was. No, you can close up your final point here. I was just gonna say we should get to that dinner scene.
Yeah, and throughout the movie, you kind of get, like, that the mutual respect that Frank and Carl develop for each other, because Carl knows
Hmm.
that this he's just a kid. He's never hurt anybody.
Yeah, and I honestly think Carl's kind of impressed by what Frank's been able to achieve.
Yeah.
And I think later on, that's kind of like why they're a little more loose with Frank's sentencing and eventually Frank getting a job with the FBI to help, catch these people.
Yeah. But then the dinner scene, we get, Carl or Frank is talking with Brenda's parents, and he decides that to impress the parents, he decides to just fib about being a lawyer.
Yeah, and then of course, out of all places to say he went to school at, he says Berkeley, and of course that's where the father went. Um,
Yeah. And the father asks
and
him about a teacher's pet and if it's alive or not. And Frank doesn't exactly know what to say, so he just kind of bullshits, and Eventually, his father gets him in a one-on-one, and he's like, "Yeah, I know you fucking lied."
Yeah, he's like, basically just tell me why you're here.
Yeah, and eventually, they he basically tells him like, "Oh, I'm a complete liar. I'm nothing. I have lied to you." And then
Yeah,
his father
but
is,
I do love your daughter.
yeah, and his father's like, "Wow, you're a romantic." And then he just lets them marry.
I mean, he also lies about being a Lutheran,
Yeah.
which is very important to them. We see them watching some type of program on the television. I don't know exactly what you'd call it, but kind of singing along, church songs and hymns of whatnot,
Yeah.
and family bonding, and they're just singing, and it's a nice family moment.
Yeah, and then we see we jump forward in time, and we see Carl and Frank in the present day after Frank has been caught, and Carl asks Frank like, "How'd you pass the bar in Louisiana?"
Hmm.
And Frank doesn't tell him. I think it's very interesting because Carl is just so convinced that he cheated on the bar.
Yeah,
But as we come to learn at the end of the movie, he actually didn't cheat.
yeah, he did the studying, or
He did the studying. And, like, I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not a lawyer. I don't know how.
really,
I don't.
you're not a lawyer?
I don't know how hard the bar exam is. So to think that he could just study without ever have gone to law school is very interesting to me.
Yeah. I mean, especially from all that we've seen, they don't show us like Frank reading these books and taking notes. We just see him watching these television programs and kind of spouting off the same language as the people in the shows.
Yeah, and so then we get him then we get Frank being a lawyer, and I think it's really funny because he's trying to apply what he saw from lawyers on movies to to like a real courtroom.
Yeah.
So he busts out like the suitcase and he brings out these photographs, and then he's like, "This is irrefutable evidence that the defendant is lying." And then the judge is like, "Yeah, there's no defendant, there's no jury, it's just me."
Yeah, you're going a little overblown for right now.
Yeah. And yeah, that's
We get another scene afterwards between Frank and his dad,
yeah.
and just another moment between them, and they're sitting down at the booth, and he's like, I'm a lawyer, and I found a girl, and Dad, I think I want to marry her.
Yeah.
So just another very touching scene between the two of them.
It's certainly interesting, and it's just between him and his father, it's just you can tell his father is very proud of him. His son's gonna be a married man, and Frank basically tells his dad like, "Don't worry, I'll take care of your married, uh, uh, you know, there are financial problems basically," and his father basically tells him like, "Oh, I had an FBI agent come to my house. Like they know who you are." And basically Frank's father tells him like, "Yes, they're never going to catch you. You're going to be fine." And it's just.
But then, cut to, we see a wedding or a ceremony at the house, and who shows up but Carl?
Yeah. And we get kind of like another phone call between Carl and Frank a little, and Frank is getting desperate. He's like, "I want this to stop," and Carl basically tells him, "Yeah, you're gonna go to prison. We're gonna catch you." He wants the chase to stop.
Mhm.
And yeah, eventually this ceremony does happen. He's getting married, and then Carl shows up, And basically he tells his wife, he's like, "Hey, I'm not who I said I was." And he pulls out this suitcase completely full of money.
Yeah, it's like overpacked basically, and he's just, he's throwing money all over the place.
Yeah.
He's kind of like, okay, meet me at this spot at this time, and everything will be okay, I promise.
Yeah. And so basically, he's like freaking out. This is like one of the first times that we see Frank genuinely freak out. He's panicking. The tables have turned. Carl
Yeah.
this time is more calm. He's confident, and and Frank is the one that's panicking. And so eventually, he tells her like, meet me at the airport. I'll pick you up there. But Carl is already ahead of him, and so.
Yeah. I think we see him panicking because this is something he actually cares about. He doesn't care about if they catch him being a pilot or various things before, but this is someone he cares about, and for the most part, something he wanted to actually happen.
Yeah, and then we see it's quite a sad scene. We see Brenda at the airport, and he's Brenda's like waiting for him, but Frank sees all the FBI agents around him watching Brenda, so he figures out he has to ditch Brenda. And so the FBI's plan is basically like, okay, we're just going to camp the airport, basically.
Yeah, tons of agents packed.
Yeah,
like some in secret, more obvious, but like people on the roof, people across the street on buildings, people in cars, full on everybody there.
Yeah, and so Frank basically he pretends to be a pilot again, and he holds like this meeting at a university where he's like, okay, he gets like a group of women. He's like, who wants to be a flight attendant? And then
just the fact that he's able to set up a meeting like that, just last minute, just be like, hey, I'm going to be stopping by your university. Yeah, time for some like auditions or.
Yeah. And so eventually he gets a bunch of really pretty women. He dresses them in the flight attendant uniform, and he basically uses them as a shield to walk to a plane. And this is this is a baller scene. Like, he really is so confident that he can just walk and use these women as basically eye candy. But
I mean, it's kind of the agent's fault for just letting them just mosey on by. But
yeah,
we all make mistakes of being distracted by a group of flight attendants in our life.
Yeah. So basically, Frank ditches America. He goes to Europe.
Yeah, might as well.
Now he's doing his little Czech scheme in Europe.
Yeah, he's moved up in the world to international crimes.
Yes.
And we see Frank is he's at this like printing press, print house. Yeah, which we of course it would be France because his mother was from France, and kind of goes along about this little village his father told him about.
Yeah, and we get this scene between Carl and Frank where Carl is just by himself in the factory. He just sent him in with Frank. And they kind of get this interesting scene where Frank is like, Carl tells him like, oh, there's a dozen French police officers out there, and he tells Frank, Frank doesn't believe him. He thinks he's bluffing, and then he said, oh, okay, if you walk out there, they're gonna kill you, but I need to walk out there with you. Surrender to me. And you kind of get this, Carl or Frank tells him, do you have any family? He's like, I have a 4-year-old daughter. And he's like, swear on your daughter. And they swears on his daughter. And then Frank puts the
Kind of like
handcuffs.
seeing, like, is he actually bluffing?
Yeah. And Frank puts the handcuffs on himself. And then they walk out. And at first, there's nobody outside this little building. And then Frank looks at Carl and he's like, that was really good, Carl. And then the French police show up. So, he really wasn't lying.
Yeah.
And then, he's yelling to the French officers who are like, they're like manhandling Frank, they're pretty pissed off. And he's like, I wanted on record that he surrendered by himself.
Yeah, and it's kind of shows how Carl kind of is a little more easygoing with Frank. He's more understanding than like any other officer we see, because he kind of knows like Frank's gotten in over his head.
Yeah, Frank is like 17 at this point.
Yeah, like not even legally an adult.
No.
And he's
Yeah, and Carl's like
a little overblown.
Yeah, Carl's like, don't worry, we're gonna have you extradited to the United States. And then we cut forward back in time, back to the plane, and this is where Frank discovers that his father is dead.
Yeah.
Basically, his father, he tells Carl in the plane, he's like, when we land, you gotta let me call my father. I want to call my father before he sees me on the TV or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then if Frank is like devastated by this news, and he says that he's gonna be sick, and they take him to the bathroom, and Frank is he's freaking out.
Yeah, he's like basically dry heaving.
Yeah, and then it turns out that Frank escaped the plane through the toilet.
This is the biggest like question mark. Like, I mean, I imagine like he's so malnourished, like this might be able to fit through there.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on airplane toilets. Okay, I've never even been on an airplane, but I'm like 90% sure you can't do that.
Well, I mean, and just the timing he would have to do to time it where it's so close to the to the ground that he could just plop onto the ground. It's like, what is this, Mission Impossible type thing?
Then it turns out that Frank ran all the way to his mother's house.
Yeah, and he, once again, Christmas time, Christmas lights,
and he
sees a little girl.
Yeah.
And this is like the final straw that breaks him. He realizes, his dad's dead. His mother's basically moved on entirely with a new family, a new child. And it's just, it's sad. And Frank gives himself up, and he's ready to go to prison.
Yeah. And so Frank goes to prison, and he's sentenced to life in prison. And so he's in prison, and then eventually Carl comes to visit him, and Carl gives him some comic books, which is very nice of Carl.
Mm-hmm.
And he brings him a fake check, and he basically shows Frank, and Frank can immediately tell it's a fake. And Carl is trying to get Frank out of prison and get him a job at the FBI so he can bust other fraudulent check guys.
I mean, might as well when you have a resource like this available.
If you can't beat him, join him.
Exactly. I mean, especially to be this young and just be so aware of like all these intricacies of like checks and check fraud and all that.
Yeah. And it turns out that Frank has to serve like, I think it's 12 years at the FBI. Then he's free to go.
Yeah.
But Frank has such a good time, or not like he finds like a job at the FBI. And it turns out that he sees a pilot uniform when he's walking home one day, and he buys this uniform, and he pretends to be a pilot.
Yeah.
And we see that Carl has followed him here, and he's like walking to get on the plane, and then Carl walks up to him and he asks him, "How do you pass the bar in Louisiana?" And he tells Frank, like, if you run, we'll catch you, and then you'll be sent to life in prison. And if you run in France, you'll die in French prison. And and he basically tells him, like, oh yeah, my family doesn't want to see me anymore. And sometimes it's easier living a lie. And then Carl lets Frank go because he'll know Frank will be back on Monday. And what do you know?
Yeah.
Frank comes back on Monday.
I mean, it's kind of set up, that he doesn't show up, but it turns out he's just a little late, and gets straight into work, checking out checks and whatnot, and that's basically the movie.
Yeah, and Frank Abagnale is still alive today, and Frank Abagnale still works at the FBI.
Yeah, you can find like he's done talks that are online. Pretty interesting, I would say, if you're interested with like some of the actual like stone cold truth behind what happened. I think they're a good listen.
Yeah, and that's the end of the movie.
That is Catch Me If You Can.
That is Catch Me If You Can. He was certainly caught, but it definitely took a lot of can.
That's my life motto. Why don't we go into a closing thoughts and our ratings?
I really like this movie. I think that is pretty great. It's definitely carried by its performances, the direction, the music. It's all great. It just adds up to a very nice little package, and it's definitely enhanced by the fact that it was based on a true story. Like, this story is freaking wild.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it's just amazing. I don't know. This is my favorite Steven Spielberg movie. Can't get better than this. So I'm gonna give this one 10 out of 10.
The big 10 out of 10.
Yeah.
There it is.
Big 10.
That's another one.
That's another one.
Very, very recent timing. I'm honestly inclined to agree with you in a way. And it feels so wrong saying this is my favorite Spielberg film, because don't get me wrong, I love so many Spielberg films. I love Jaws. I love most of the Indiana Jones films. I love Jurassic Park. And I'm not saying this is Steven Spielberg at his like technical best.
No, I agree with that.
There's Schindler's List, which is a masterpiece, of course. And there's, I think because you and I were not children of the '80s or '90s. We didn't grow up with that same nostalgia. And this is another topic for another day. But there's just something about this film I love so much. And I mean, I don't know if I can give it a perfect 10 out of 10, just because it does take those liberties of like kind of elevating things and making things one way or another. But damn, is this film so good. Damn, is Leonardo DiCaprio so captivating. Christopher Walken is amazing. Tom Hanks is amazing. The score, this is one of my favorite film scores, I think, of all time. And yeah, it's just very interesting. It's one that I can put on and just have it play in the background, but also captivate me. It's I can put this on, and this is like a 2-hour plus film, and it doesn't seem to like drag for me.
Yeah, it's definitely paced very well.
Yeah, it always engages me. But yeah, just a joy, and I think this is definitely Spielberg's most underrated film. And I would probably give this. I'll give it a 9.5. I'll give it a 9.5. Almost. It's very good. But yeah, that basically wraps this up. If you enjoyed, you can like, you can comment, you can subscribe. Let us know your thoughts on Catch Me If You Can. Also, a long time ago, did a Catch Me If You Can commentary. I haven't listened to that in a while. Maybe in the future we'll do a redux of it, and do it again. But yeah, let us know what you thought, and we have a tease for next episode. Nanda, why don't you give us a little tease to this movie?
Well, this movie is it's quite new to me.
Well, it's quite new to a lot of people. It's only been out for like 3 years, give or take.
Yeah, this movie, I haven't seen this one before. You know, I just, it's gonna be interesting to see it again. You know, Chase, I'm not even confident that I can tell them. I haven't seen it. You do it.
Oh, you haven't seen it?
No.
Oh, well, in that case, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to be watching the 2019 film Marriage Story, directed by Noah Baumbach.
Yeah.
This is quite the. I enjoy this film a lot, and I'm excited to get into it.
I'm of course joking. Of course, I've seen Marriage Story. That movie's bomb.
I was about to say you were pulling a big old twist on me. I was about ready to cut some stuff out and get to bloopers because that was, you baited me, man.
Yeah.
No, I knew you've seen it. We've had long discussions about it. There may be a special a bonus.
Yeah.
In the end of that episode.
There's definitely going to be a special bonus.
Join us for Marriage Story. It's going to be a great conversation. Who wouldn't want to hear two teens talk about love and divorce?
Yeah. Well, with that, everybody, that does it for us. Thank you for watching. Have a good one.
Thank you. Goodbye.